The French president pushes for a stronger European role within NATO, Emmanuel Macron adding that the body needs to engage in dialogue with Russia. The House Judiciary Committee begins to weigh findings by U.S. lawmakers that the president misused his office for personal political gain. The body is responsible for drafting articles of impeachment. And France braces for a massive strike. Severe disruptions expected on metros and long-distance train lines on Thursday, and a majority of schools across the country are expected to close. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. I'm Delano de Souza. First, NATO members have agreed to a joint declaration on the alliance's 70th anniversary. Leaders from the 29-nation Transatlantic Alliance met for a final session near London. The body's Secretary General tried to display a united front, saying NATO members stood together and the alliance was ironclad. The French president spoke earlier, calling for a bigger European role within the body. Emmanuel Macron also adding that NATO needs to engage in dialogue with Russia.
We know how Russia involves itself in other countries' internal affairs, its campaign of political interference, the violations of international rights, and the use of chemical attacks. Nevertheless, if we want to move on, we have to re-engage the dialogue. NATO must be credible as an organization.
For more on this story, we can go across to France 24's Armin Georgian, standing by at the NATO summit near London. Armin, Emmanuel Macron ruffled a lot of feathers going into this NATO summit, but did he get what he wanted in the end?
Well, the people close to Macron are drawing our attention to a particular point in this NATO final document, which is point 7, and it calls for a forward-looking reflection process. This is something that Macron was pushing for. He managed to get it included in the final communique, but it seems to stop short of what he actually wanted, which was a strategic review. Just to remind you, the last NATO strategic review dates back to 2010, so it has not updated that review for nearly 10 years, and Macron was hoping for something a little bit firmer. It seems that his desire got a little bit watered down, but that really reflects the broader nature of this final communique, which is pretty bland and vague. So the forward-looking reflection process is kind of pretty much in line with the other quite fuzzy statements made in this London declaration. The language is very much things like we are committed to ensuring, we reaffirm our commitment to XYZ, we recognize the need to ensure, and so forth and so forth. We must look to the future together. So not much concrete things really to come out of this final declaration, and one still doesn't have the sense at the end of this 70th anniversary summit that NATO has a very clear or concrete idea of where the next chapter of its history might be.
So lots of divisions clearly where you are. Now, Armin, the French president also mentioned some new developments concerning the Sahel region. What were they?
Yes, well, this was actually the most startling part of the press conference, to me anyway. Firstly, on the news side, so he announced that he was inviting the G5 Sahel leaders to, that's to say Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania. The leaders of those countries will be invited to Pau in southern France, which is a town that was particularly badly hit by the loss of those 13 French soldiers in Mali, because those French soldiers, many of them were attached to a military base in Pau. So that's a kind of symbolic place for this summit to happen with Macron and the G5 leaders on December the 16th. Macron saying he wants clear answers. He wants clear answers from the G5 leaders on what is next in the Sahel strategy. There's a sense within the French presidency that things cannot go on as they are. after the death of those French soldiers. The French government has been waiting for several years for the G5 Sahel military force to be fully operational. It is still not fully operational. So Macron is trying to kind of give this whole G5 process a push. And he said, and I think this was the most startling part of the press conference, he says, do they want a French presence? They need to tell me, do they want us to stay in the Sahel or not? And what he meant by that was that while the leaders of the G5 had been publicly thanking France for its military involvement, those same leaders have allowed some of their ministers to say anti-French things, or things that have been seen as anti-French sentiment. You know, words like imperialism or colonialism have occasionally been bandied around. So what Macron wants to do is to stop this kind of double language. So on the one hand, the leaders asking for French help or thanking France for its help, but then other members of the same governments essentially criticizing France. And so he wants clarity on that issue.
Indeed. Armin, thank you very much for that update. Armin Georgian reporting there from that NATO summit. In other news, the House Judiciary Committee has begun to weigh findings by U.S. lawmakers that the president misused his office for personal political gain and even obstructed Congress's investigation. The body is responsible for drafting articles of impeachment. On Tuesday, the House Intelligence Committee released its 300-page report, which found serious misconduct by Donald Trump.
This is the first hearing we are conducting pursuant to House Resolution.
Overwhelming evidence of misconduct. The claims of a key report released by the House Intelligence Committee as part of its impeachment inquiry into U.S. President Donald Trump.
This report chronicles a scheme by the President of the United States to coerce an ally, Ukraine, that is at war with an adversary, Russia, into doing the President's political dirty work. It involves a scheme in which Donald Trump withheld official acts, a White House meeting, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars of needed military assistance in order to compel that power to deliver 2 investigations that he believed would assist his re-election campaign.
The report spells out 2 main areas of wrongdoing by Trump. Firstly, abuse of power. It alleges that Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine and a White House meeting with its president in a bid to strong-arm Kiev into opening an investigation into Joe Biden, Trump's Democratic rival in the 2020 presidential election. Secondly, the report claims Trump obstructed justice by refusing to provide documents to investigators and preventing some witnesses from testifying. Democrats believe the 300-page report lays out grounds for impeachment, but Republicans think otherwise.
The impeachment process slowly drags on with no direction, no focus, because they're having one big problem. And the big problem is the president did nothing wrong, and they can't prove it.
The document will now be sent to the House Judiciary Committee, which will hold its own hearings and decide whether to draft articles of impeachment in the coming weeks. If that committee does draft articles of impeachment and the Democratic-led House passes them, the case will go to the Republican-led Senate, where a 2/3 majority would be required to convict Trump in order to actually remove him from office. The U.S. president has denied all allegations.
Hassan Rouhani has admitted to heavy-handed policing during the recent fuel protests over in Iran. The Iranian president even suggesting some of those arrested should be released. Rouhani said the door to talks with the United States remains open, provided sanctions on Iran are dropped. Sam Bradpeace reports.
After weeks of deadly clashes between protesters and the authorities in Iran, the country's president has admitted that some of the policing went too far.
You know that among all those people that have been arrested, some are innocent and should be freed. They were arrested just like that.
The protests captured here on Iranian state television were sparked by eye-watering hikes to fuel prices by as much as 300% in mid-November. They quickly morphed into a wider anti-government movement, and the response was brutal, with authorities using live ammunition on demonstrators and imposing a week-long internet blackout. More than 200 people were killed in clashes, according to Amnesty International. Life for ordinary Iranians has become increasingly tough since last year, when US President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed crippling sanctions on the country. President Rouhani said he would be open to negotiation with the US through the UN Security Council, referred to here as the P5, if sanctions are removed.
I am telling the nation of Iran that whenever America is prepared to put aside its wrong, cruel, unlawful, incorrect terrorist sanctions, the heads of the P5+1 can meet immediately.
Washington, meanwhile, has ruled out the lifting of sanctions unless Iran further scales back its nuclear sector and scraps its ballistic missile program.
The death toll from a measles outbreak in Samoa has risen to 60. This is the latest flare-up of the global measles epidemic. The tiny Pacific nation will grind to a halt on Thursday and Friday as public servants will help with an ongoing vaccination drive. Jean-Emile Jamin reports.
A desperate helplessness and an overwhelming grief. Elsie Lolesio's 1-year-old daughter, Noelle, buried next to her 1-year-old nephew, Fatau Jr., the deaths just 3 days apart.
We have a lot of dreams that we need to fulfill for our little ones. But once they lost, we don't know what to do. And we don't know how to accept it.
By Wednesday, the death toll from last month's measles outbreak in Samoa had risen to over 60, the vast majority of those children. Lanuola Naseri buried her only son on Wednesday, with the help of donations that allowed her to purchase him a suit and shirt for his funeral.
I don't know how can I forget my little boy.
There are now more than 4,000 cases of measles recorded, 2% of the entire island nation's deeply religious population.
It would be so nice for all our people out there to actually see and witness what is the real life out here. This is the real life. This is what we face every day.
Medical services are also strained.
Some of those children are dying in front of us, in front of them, and in front of other families in the intensive care unit.
Low vaccination rates led government last month to implement compulsory immunization under a state of emergency. And officials on Wednesday asked unvaccinated families to identify themselves with a red flag outside their homes.
The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is demanding a thorough and independent investigation into the murder of Daphne Galizia. The Maltese journalist known as the One Woman WikiLeaks was blown up in a bomb attack back in 2017. A European delegation is in the country on a fact-finding mission. They are in Malta after the Prime Minister offered to resign in January. France 24's Ellen Gainsford reports.
Well, I'm in front of Europe House here in Valletta, the capital of Malta, where we've been following a team of MEPs who are here on a fact-finding mission. And they're here to see whether the rule of law is being respected. That, of course, follows the murder of investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed by a car bomb in 2017. But the problems here range beyond more than just one person, as allegations of corruption reaching to the highest levels of government and institutions, including the judiciary. Well, we can take a listen now to the head of that delegation of MEPs, Sophie Antveld, who earlier told us what she's learned over the past 2 days.
Well, we are very concerned with what we have seen. We do feel that there are very serious risks to the rule of law. We see a lot of corruption. We also see a lot of insecurity and distrust, people not knowing what is happening. So the European Parliament is really going to follow this very, very closely. We're also going to call on the European Commission to immediately start a dialogue in the rule of law framework.
Well, Prime Minister Joseph Muscat has said that he'll be stepping down in January. But for many people here in Malta, that won't solve the country's problems. They're calling for profound constitutional and structural changes.
Large swatches of France's workforce will be going on strike on Thursday. This in protest of the government's planned pension reforms. Rail workers will also be going on a rolling strike, with metro services and long-distance train lines set to be severely impacted.
By law, public sector transport workers must give their employers 48 hours notice of their intention to strike. This allows the French railway operator SNCF to announce its traffic plans at least 24 hours before disruptions begin. Based on the information it's received, the company has warned about major transport chaos on Thursday, with only 1 in 10 trains running as normal. The best served routes will be the high-speed TGV lines between Paris and other major cities in France, including Bordeaux, Lille and Marseille. Meanwhile, around half of Eurostar trains, including 16 between Paris and London, have already been cancelled, according to the company's website. Also striking are employees of RATP, which runs Paris's public transport system. Only 2 lines on the metro will be operating as usual, 11 lines will be closed, and 3 will be running during rush hour only. Regional train, bus and tram lines will also be badly hit. Last but not least, air travel will be affected. 3 of the unions representing ground crew for Air France have joined the strike, along with air traffic control staff. 20% of flights, most of them short-haul, have been cancelled on Thursday.
That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.